Rain lashes against the weather-beaten stone of Sacred Heart Chapel. The ancient walls slick with moisture, dark as the Atlantic beyond. A rusted iron gate groans faintly in the wind, its hinges strained, yellow police tape tangled around its spiked bars faded now, but still there, like a scar that refuses to heal. The crucifix above the chapel door creaks on its chain, swaying rhythmically, casting shadows that stretch and twist with each gust. The sky is low, heavy with charcoal clouds, pressing down on the jagged coastline where the convent sits like a forgotten relic, crumbling under the weight of time and unanswered questions. Narrator, **, in the bitter winter of 1992, 3 women entered the Sacred Heart Convent ... and vanished. A flash of lightning reveals the outline of the chapel's arched doorway massive, weathered oak doors sealed shut. Salt crusts the edges, sea mist curling along the crumbled stone steps, as if the ocean itself reaches for what the land refuses to forget. Sister Margaret Calloway, age 62. A devoted caretaker known for her quiet discipline. Novice, Ruiz, 19. Barely months into her vows, eager, bright-eyed, full of trembling faith. And Dr. Lillian Greer, 44. A psychologist sent by the diocese to evaluate claims of unrest within these walls. Wind keens through broken stained glass windows, the faded remnants of saints fractured and bleeding color onto the chapel floor. Inside, the pews rot, Bibles gather dust, and silence looms, thick and oppressive a silence that has smothered this place for over 3 decades. They arrived as the first snow fell, greeted by locked doors, flickering candlelight, and an order of nuns rumored to be older than the convent itself. Archival photographs fade in grainy black and white. Portraits of solemn-faced women in habits, their eyes hollow, their expressions unreadable. Another photo, Sacred Heart Convent in 1910, newly built, pristine against the cliffs, an institution whispered about even then. No struggle, no bodies, no answers. The camera pans to a weather-stained sign barely clinging to the stone. Wall, Sacred Heart Conventus, 1894, in silence. Salvation, below it, the iron gate, once again, locked, wrapped in decades-old police tape, fluttering like a warning. Only a locked gate, and a silence that still haunts the jagged coast of Maine. Waves crash violently against the rocks, spray rising like ghostly fingers into the fog. The crucifix swings faster now, its chain creaking, the image of Christ twisting in the shadows as the wind howls. 33 years later. What happened inside Sacred Heart remains buried, hidden behind vows, shadows, and fear. The screen fades to black as the storm rages, the chapel vanishing into the mist. The drone glides low over the rugged coastline of Maine, the Atlantic roaring below like an endless, hungry beast. Jagged cliffs slice upward from the sea, their edges sharp and unforgiving, shrouded in a veil of rolling fog. The sky is dull slate, heavy with moisture, pressing low over the land like a smothering hand. Barrows Point juts defiantly into the ocean, crooked finger of land shaped by centuries of storms, tragedy, and whispers. Atop the cliffs, perched like a forgotten monument, rises Sacred Heart, Conventer, hulking relic of grey stone, spires cracked, stained glass windows fractured, its roof sagging beneath decades of rain and neglect. The building seems to lean into the mist, its Gothic arches and crumbling buttresses barely holding against the erosion of time. Asterisk cut off by cliffs and forest. Sacred Heart has watched over Barrows Point for 140 years. Asterisk, the camera pulls back, revealing the dense, skeletal forest encroaching from the mainland, black pines swaying in the wind like sentinels, their spindly branches clawing at the sky. There are no neighboring homes, no roads visible from the air, only winding footpaths lost beneath the undergrowth and the faint, weathered line of a forgotten carriage road disappearing into the woods. Isolation here isn't an accident, it's by design. Generations of locals have learned to steer clear of Barrows Point, their warnings buried in folklore, half-truths, and rumors that cling to this stretch of coast like the fog itself. Sacred Heart Convent was once a symbol of resilience, place for quiet devotion, service, and retreat from a world brimming with noise and sin. Founded in 1884 by an obscure Catholic order, the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy, its mission was simple on paper: to provide sanctuary for women of faith and to care for the sick, the orphaned, and the lost. But even in its earliest days, Sacred Heart carried an unsettling reputation. Locals whispered of strange rituals, of nuns seen wandering the cliffs at night, chanting in foreign tongues, of shipwreck survivors brought to the convent for care and never seen again. Asterisk, a place of faith and shadows. Asterisk, the screen lingers on the convent's bell tower, its rusted cross leaning precariously, corroded by sea, air, and years of disuse. Below, the chapel's heavy doors stand closed, warped from rain and salt. Moss creeps across the stone walls, vines choking the once immaculate facade. This is not a place that time forgot. This is a place time has tried to erase, yet still it clings to the cliffs, stubborn, decaying, and heavy with secrets. In the distance, the ocean stretches out, endless and grey, its waves crashing relentlessly against the rocks below. The fog curls tighter around Sacred Heart, swallowing its silhouette, until only the faintest outline remains, a jagged shadow looming in the mist. Watching, waiting, black and white photographs fade onto the screen, their edges frayed, the images grainy with age. Each face tells a story, a snapshot, frozen before the storm swallowed them whole. First Sister Miriam Doyle, 33 years old. Her portrait reveals a slender woman with sharp features and eyes lowered in quiet obedience. A simple silver crucifix rests at the hollow of her throat, her habit pressed neatly, as though every fibre of her being bends toward discipline. Asterisk, Sister Miriam Doyle, 33, reserved, devout, raised in Portland, Maine, the daughter of Irish immigrants. Miriam entered Sacred Heart at 19, determined to devote her life to God and to distance herself from the world beyond the convent walls. Records describe her as meticulous, withdrawn, a woman of few words but fierce conviction. She rarely ventured beyond the convent grounds, even when permitted. To those within Sacred Heart, she was a quiet pillar of faith. To those outside, almost a ghost. The screen shifts to another photograph. Sister Evelyn Crane, 29. A faint smirk pulls at the corner of her lips, rare defiance in a sea of solemn faces. Her eyes are wide, bright, restless. Asterisk, Sister Evelyn Crane, spirited, a troubled past. Born in Massachusetts, Evelyn's early life was marked by instability, an alcoholic mother, a revolving door of foster homes, juvenile detention by age 15. But at 24, after a spiral of arrests and institutions, she entered Sacred Heart seeking, some say, salvation. Others whispered it was an escape. Asterisk, her faith was fervent, but her past never far behind. Within the convent, Evelyn was a paradox, quick to laugh but quicker to anger. Known for questioning authority, her restless energy barely contained beneath the veil. Some believed she didn't belong there at all. The last photograph appears faded, creased at the corners. Sister Agnes Walsh, 44. Her face is harder to read, her expression flat, eyes distant. A caretaker by role, yet known more for her silence than her service. Asterisk, Sister Agnes Walsh, 44. The quiet hand that kept Sacred Heart running. Born in Belfast, Ireland, Agnes came to the United States during the Troubles, her family history marked by violence and loss. She never spoke of it. To the sisters, she was reliable, a woman who cleaned, cooked, mended, and remained unnoticed. Her presence was constant, yet strangely absent. Parish records note her as unremarkable, a figure so woven into the background of Sacred Heart. Most never truly saw her, but those who paid attention sensed more beneath the surface, on unease, a hollow in her eyes. Asterisk, 3 women, 3 lives bound by faith and secrets. Asterisk, they arrived together on the same frigid morning, December 17th, 1992, amid the howling Atlantic winds, snow falling like ash along the cliffs. Locals remember seeing them walk the narrow path to Sacred Heart, their figures small against the towering walls, their footprints the only marks in the fresh snow. Hours later, the convent doors closed behind them. Days passed, no word, no sign of their return. By the time investigators forced the gates open, the building stood empty, silent, abandoned, as though no one had set foot inside for decades. Asterisk, 3 women, 1 vanishing, no struggle, no witnesses, just silence, and the shadows of Sacred Heart. Asterisk. The camera lingers on their faces once more. Miriam's devotion, Evelyn's defiance, Agnes's vacancy. Their portraits flicker, dissolve, and vanish into black, leaving only the sound of crashing waves and the low, steady groan of wind pushing against the forgotten convent walls. Archival footage flickers onto the screen, grainy images of barrows, point residents from the early 1990s, bundled in heavy coats, their faces weathered by wind and salt. They stand in tight clusters outside modest homes, on the worn wooden docks, at the single gas station that marks the edge of town, voices low, eyes cautious. Even now, decades later, when asked about Sacred Heart, those same guarded expressions return. The convent has always been an uneasy presence here, looming on the cliffs like a stain that the fog can't quite swallow. The weeks leading up to the disappearance of the 3 women were marked by a growing tension that even the most skeptical townsfolk couldn't ignore. It began subtly at first. Fishermen reported strange lights flickering along the cliffs at night, soft golden orbs that hovered unnaturally in the mist before vanishing without sound. At first, most dismissed it as atmospheric tricks, fog, refracting headlights, the lighthouse beam catching the spray of waves. But as the days grew shorter and the cold set in, the sightings became harder to explain. Old-timers spoke of hearing faint chanting drifting down from the convent after dark, a low, rhythmic hum carried by the wind, too distant to decipher yet persistent enough to gnaw at the nerves. Some claimed it was the sisters at prayer, nothing unusual, though those who'd lived here longest whispered that Sacred Heart's midnight rituals had always been different. Less hymn, more lament. Less worship, more warning. Inside the town's only bar, the Mariner's Lantern, the stories took on sharper edges. Locals nursed drinks and traded hushed accounts of figures seen along the cliff's hooded shapes moving in single file beneath the crescent moon, their forms swallowed by fog before vanishing entirely. Dogs refused to approach the forest paths leading to the convent. Birds fell eerily silent at dusk. Even the sea seemed to churn more violently near Barrow's Point, waves clawing hungrily at the rocks as if drawn to something beneath the convent walls. One resident, Margaret Holloway, then in her late 60s, recalls the unsettling change in atmosphere vividly. In a faded interview from 1994, she clutches her cardigan tight, eyes darting toward the fog-cloaked horizon. It was like the air itself went sour, she murmurs, voice cracking. Asterisk, felt it in your bones, like something was waiting. Asterisk, by early December, the stories turned darker. A fisherman, Peter Walshnow, relation to Sister Agnes, claimed to have found strange symbols carved into driftwood along the shore near the convent. Intertwining circles, unfamiliar runes, patterns that made the skin crawl. He burned the wood. But the next morning, identical symbols were found scratched into the sand, higher than the tide line should have reached. Others dismissed it as local teenagers playing pranks. But no one stepped forward, and the carvings kept appearing, simultaneously. Those few who interacted with Sacred Heart's residents noted a palpable change within the convent itself. The once reclusive sisters became almost entirely withdrawn. Supply deliveries were left untouched outside the gates. Mail piled up at the local post office. The chapel bells, traditionally rung at dawn and dusk, fell silent. Father Thomas Greer, the parish priest from neighboring Milltown, nan brother to one of the missing women. Dr. Lillian Guerrera tempted multiple visits to Sacred Heart, but was turned away at the locked gates each time. Father Greer's own words, recorded shortly after the women vanished, echo with quiet frustration and veiled fear. Asterisk, they wouldn't. Answer, only Sister Agnes at the gate, and her eyes blank, like she wasn't really there. She told me all was well, but there was no light in the windows, no sound, just this, heavy silence. Asterisk, as Christmas approached, the tension ripened into dread. The strange lights intensified. Some claimed they pulsed in patterns, like signals. Others swore they rose vertically into the sky before extinguishing like dying stars. More symbols appeared etched into the frost on windows and vehicles parked. Near the forest's edge, delicate, cryptic, gone by morning. The chanting grew louder, unmistakable to those walking the shoreline at nighter haunting. Low dirge that seemed to rise from the very cliffs themselves. The final, chilling detail came from Daniel Pike, the local postman whose route included the steep trail to Sacred Heart. On December 16th, the morning before the women vanished, he approached the convent with a parcel routine, despite the growing rumors. The mist was thick, the sky overcast, the ground slick with ice. As he neared the gate, he noticed something that still unsettles him to this day. There were no footprints, he recounted years later, voice thin with lingering unease. Asterisk, no tracks in the snow, fresh snow, clean, untouched, but I could see shadows, figures behind the chapel windows, moving, watching, but no prints leading in or out. Asterisk, the parcel was never claimed, and then they disappeared. Sister Miriam Doyle, Sister Evelyn Crane, Sister Agnes Walshtry women, 3 lives, swallowed by Sacred Heart without warning or trace. But to those paying attention, the convent had been whispering its warning for weeks. Lights over the cliffs, chanting. In the fog, symbols in the sand, and that growing, suffocating sense that something old, something patient, had awakened behind those crumbling walls. The screen lingers on the faces of the townsfolk, weathered, wary, some shaking their heads, others crossing themselves, reluctant to speak further. The fog thickens, swirling over Barrow's Point, and the convent looms in the distance, silent, watchful, as if still listening, still waiting. The news of the disappearances spread through Barrow's Point like wildfire, igniting old fears and exposing deep fractures within the tight-knit, isolated community. For a place used to the steady rhythm of fishing boats, church bells, and coastal storms, the vanishing of 3 women without trace, without warning, was like a stone hurled into still water. The ripples reached every home, every weather-beaten face, every frayed edge of belief. The small town, known for its suspicion of outsiders and its reverence for tradition, found itself suddenly at war with itself. The fault lines were clear: faith versus fear. The first headlines appeared within hours of the police confirming the convent was empty. Yellowed newspaper clippings filled the screen: asterisk, 3 missing from Sacred Heart. Mystery deepens along Maine coast. Convent cloaked in silence. Local news crews descended like gulls to a shipwreck, their cameras panning across the windswept cliffs, their reports tinged with unease. Television broadcasts from December 1992 flicker across the screener. Young reporter, microphone trembling. In the Atlantic wind, standing before the rusted iron gates of Sacred Heart. Her words brittle with rehearsed calm. Asterisk, authorities are baffled tonight after 3 women were reported missing from the Sacred Heart Convent on Barrow's Point. The reporter's voice strains over the roar of waves. Asterisk, the convent, long known for its seclusion, now finds itself at the center of growing concern. Asterisk, the town's reaction was immediate and divided. For many, Sacred Heart had always been more than just a crumbling relic on the cliffs. It was a symbol of faith, of endurance. Generations had been baptized, married, and buried under the gaze of the convent's weathered stone walls. The sisters were seen as guardians of tradition, stewards of the community's moral compass, even if their rituals were cloaked in old-world mystery. When news broke of the disappearances, parishioners flooded St. Jude's Church, lighting candles. Beneath stained glass depictions of saints and martyrs, rosaries clattered between trembling fingers. Vigils stretched late into the frozen nights as prayers for the missing were whispered into the darkness. Father Thomas Greer, visibly shaken by his own sister's involvement, stood before his congregation, voice cracking as he urged unity, hope, and restraint. "We do not abandon our faith in fear," he implored, the echo of church bells long silenced. Behind him, asterisk, "We are tested. Yes, but our answers lie in God, not suspicion." Asterisk, but beyond the church walls, a different sentiment brewed. Others in Barrow's Point had always viewed Sacred Heart with wary eyes. Stories of secretive rituals, strange symbols, and whispered chants were nothing new, but for decades they had been tolerated, peculiar but harmless eccentricity. The disappearances changed everything. Theories bloomed overnight, wild and unrestrained, fed by decades of folklore and fresh fear. At the Mariner's Lantern, fishermen and townsfolk gathered over whiskey and coffee, their voices low but heated. Some believed the women had run away, fleeing the rigid, reclusive life behind convent walls. But others spoke of darker possibilities: hidden abuse, cult activity, even human sacrifice. The old legends resurfaced like rot beneath peeling wallpaper tales of shipwreck. Survivors taken to Sacred Heart and never seen again, of cryptic symbols carved along the shore, of hooded figures wandering the cliffs by moonlight. A grainy TV segment from 1992 plays, showing police combing the convent grounds, dogs sniffing through brittle undergrowth, officers disappearing into the chapel's looming shadow. The official line was cautious, * no signs of foul play. Investigation ongoing, but within the town, speculation festered. Candlelight vigils transformed into protests for some. Flyers plastered telephone poles, demanding transparency, accountability. Locals like Daniel Pike, the postman who'd last approached the convent, found himself cornered by reporters, his hesitant account of shadows without footprints dissected and debated. Others, like Margaret Holloway, were more direct, recalling the strange lights, the symbols, the oppressive silence that blanketed Sacred Heart in the weeks before the women vanished. I told them something wasn't right. Holloway's weathered voice cracks in archival footage, her eyes darting toward the cliffs even decades later. But no one listens till it's too late. As winter deepened, the town's tension curdled into paranoia. Parents kept children indoors. Fishermen refused to sail near Barrows Point. Tourists, few as they were in winter, reported unsettling encounters, visions of robed figures at the edge of the fog, distant chanting that rose and fell with the tide. The divide between believers and skeptics grew sharper. Faith leaders doubled down, urging patience and prayer. But others began to accuse. Former residents came forward with forgotten grievances. Stories of ex-sisters silenced by shame, of women who entered Sacred Heart and emerged changed, haunted, unwilling to speak of their time within those walls. Local police, overwhelmed and ill-equipped for the media frenzy, struggled to contain the growing storm. Search efforts expanded briefly before being quietly scaled back. No evidence. No leads, no answers. The gates of Sacred Heart remained chained. The investigation stalled, and the town's anger simmered just beneath the surface. National attention arrived briefly, amplifying the fractures within Barrows Point. Cable news anchors framed the mystery as both sensational and cautionary, Gothic ghost story draped in religious intrigue. Headlines flashed across the country. The main vanishing, cult or crime. Sacred Heart's secrets. Theories multiplied satanic. Panic revivalists blamed dark rituals. Fringe religious groups claimed divine punishment. Conspiracy theorists insisted government cover up. Meanwhile, Sacred Heart stood silent. With the convent abandoned, rumors flourished unchecked. Some claimed the building itself was cursed, that its foundations hid ancient catacombs or sealed chambers. Others believed the sisters, those who hadn't vanished, had fled, blending back into society to escape exposure. A few clung to the hope that the missing women were still alive, hidden, protected, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But most understood, even if they couldn't say it aloud, that the women were gone. How or why remained buried beneath superstition, fear, and the relentless march of time. In the decades that followed, Barrows Point never truly recovered. Businesses closed, the population dwindled, and Sacred Heart decayed, its Gothic spires and weathered stone now home to seagulls and the creeping touch of moss and salt. The cliffs eroded, the forest crept closer, and the fog thickened, swallowing the convent silhouette as if nature itself wished to erase the place. Yet the tension, the fractures never healed. The town remains divided, in memory, haunted, not only by the mystery of 3 vanished women, but by the deeper question: What do we allow to thrive in silence? What festers when faith blinds us and fear drives us apart? The screen fades to black as the wind howls across the cliffs. Candle flames guttering in the dark, their flickering light casting long, distorted shadows that refuse to disappear. The search began quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the weight of Sacred Heart's history made even the authorities tread carefully. For days the investigation had stalled. No witnesses, no signs of forced entry, no footprints but Daniel Pike's. The convent loomed in the fog, locked, silent, seemingly deserted. Yet the unease in Barrow's Point grew louder by the hour, rumors multiplying like cracks beneath the surface. It wasn't long before pressure from the town, fueled by media frenzy and mounting fear, forced the police to expand their efforts beyond polite questions and half-hearted perimeter checks. On December 24th, exactly 1 week after the disappearance, the first major incident shattered the fragile illusion of calm. The day broke bleak and grey, the wind bitter, carrying salt and the faint metallic scent of impending snow. Patrol cars idled at the edge of the old carriage road leading to Sacred Heart, their headlights cutting thin beams through the mist. The search team assembled officers from Barrow's Point, a handful of county deputies, and 2 K9 units brought in from Milltown. Most were skeptical. Sacred Heart had a reputation, but superstitions didn't make a missing persons case. Still, the mood was taut, brittle, every conversation clipped, every glance at the cliffs uneasy. Footage from that day flickers onto the screen, archival police video. Shaky, grainy, capturing the overgrown grounds, the towering stone walls, streaked with rain, the skeletal trees twisting along the cliff edge. Officers fan out, methodically working the perimeter. The dogs strain at their leashes, paws crunching over frostbitten grass. At first, the search yields nothing but decay. Wood, shattered glass, doors swollen shut from moisture. Inside, the chapel is as abandoned as it appeared a week earlier, dust layering the pews, broken candles tilting on rusted holders, the crucifix above the altar tilting ominously to one side. It was near the chapel steps, on the eastern side, that they found it. The first officer noticed the stain, a dark smear on the stone landing, barely visible in the weak winter light. As others approached, the details sharpened. Blood, faint at first, soaked into the porous rock, but unmistakably dull, rusty crimson against the weather-worn grey. The smear extended in erratic patterns along the edge of the steps, fading toward the overgrown path that curved toward the cliffs. The camera lingers on crime scene photographs, the grainy, high contrast, images capturing the dried blood, the eerie stillness of the grounds. No bodies, no drag marks, no visible struggle. Just blood, staining the chapel's threshold like a grotesque offering. The dogs reacted next. As officers examined the stain, one of the canines south, a German shepherd named Rex, began barking furiously, hackles raised, eyes locked toward the cliffs. Moments later, the second dog joined in, their frantic howls cutting through the wind like sirens. Handlers struggled to restrain them as they lunged toward the cliffside, teeth bared, noses twitching. The officers followed, flashlights slicing through the fog as they combed the edge, the jagged rocks below barely visible through the rolling mist. What they found wasn't a body, but it deepened the mystery and the dread dot near the cliffs. Edge, partially buried beneath frostbitten earth and dead leaves, they uncovered more blood, fresh this time, still damp, vivid against the pale, frozen ground. A small pile of tattered fabric lay nearby, scraps of what appeared to be a nun's habit, black wool, frayed and torn, stained crimson. No sign of the wearer. No footprints leading in or out. Only the impossible, chilling evidence that something had bled near the convent and vanished. News of the discovery spread through Barrow's Point within hours. By nightfall, the town was alight with speculation, fear hardening into panic. Theories exploded in every direction. Some clung to the idea of an accident, a tragic fall, perhaps one of the sisters injured and lost in the cliffs. Others were less hopeful. The absence of bodies, the clean edges of the torn fabric, the inexplicable patterns of the bloodstains, none of it fit neatly into rational explanations. For many, the old stories clawed their way back to the surface. The cliffs had claimed lives before fishermen swept out to sea, teenagers daring fate along the jagged edges. But this felt different. The convent, the lights, the chanting, the symbols, each detail layered upon the next, like the verses of some forgotten hymn of warning. And now, blood on the chapel steps, blood near the cliffs, but no bodies, no answers, police cordoned off. The area doubling security around Sacred Heart, but the damage was done. The thin barrier between mystery and terror had ruptured. Candlelight vigils turned somber. Prayer circles faltered beneath the weight of uncertainty. Even the most devout began to avoid the path to the convent, their faith rattled by what the stone steps had revealed. In private, investigators admitted their confusion. No evidence of forced entry. No footprints despite fresh snow days prior. No signs of struggle beyond the stains. And the blood itself, preliminary tests confirmed it was human. Type O negative, a match for one of the missing women, Sister Miriam Doyle, but without a body. The questions only deepened. What happened on those chapel steps? Who bled at the cliff's edge? How could someone vanish without a trace, leaving behind only crimson on stone and scraps of fabric, as though torn from the pages of a nightmare? The discovery transformed Sacred Heart from a place of whispered suspicion to the epicenter of a deepening, unspeakable terror. The camera lingers on the blood-stained stone, the shredded fabric, the snarling dogs restrained near the cliffs, their instincts screaming what the town already feared, that something watched from the mist, from the cracks in the stone, from the shadows that refused to loosen their grip on Sacred Heart. And whatever it wasn't finished. The history of Sacred Heart Convent is as weathered and fractured as the stone walls that still cling to the cliffs of Barrow's Point. From its founding in the late 19th century, the convent has stood as both sanctuary and source of unease, a place of whispered faith, isolation, and buried secrets. Archival photographs flicker onto the screen, sepia-toned images of stern-faced nuns standing in rigid lines, the jagged cliffs of Barrow's Point looming behind them. The convent newly built, its Gothic arches and towering spires pristine against the bleak Atlantic sky. Sacred Heart's past is tangled, woven with faith, folklore, and scandal. Founded in 1884 by the Sisters of Perpetual Mercy, Sacred Heart was conceived as a refuge, a remote, self-sustaining order meant to house women dedicated to contemplative prayer, charity, and the care of the vulnerable. The official church records paint an image of quiet piety, but beneath the surface, a darker narrative pulsed from the beginning. The convent's isolated location, perched atop cliffs, surrounded by dense forest and treacherous sea, was chosen deliberately, shrouding Sacred Heart in physical and spiritual seclusion. But that isolation also birthed rumors, local legends, trace whispers of strange practices back to the convent's earliest days. Residents spoke of unusual rites conducted at midnight, of hymns that weren't in Latin or English but older, guttural tongues no one could quite identify. Ships wrecked off the nearby coast were said to have survivors escorted to Sacred Heart, for yet many were never seen again. In the town archives, faded newspaper clippings from the 1890s tell of missing orphans taken in by the sisters, never to return to town life. The church offered explanations, adoptions, transfers to other parishes, but no documentation ever surfaced, only silence and missing names. As the decades passed, Sacred Heart's reputation deepened into shadow. The most persistent of these shadows revolved around exorcisms rarely acknowledged publicly but murmured about in Catholic enclaves across New England. Former parish records, incomplete and heavily redacted, reference spiritual interventions conducted at the convent, especially between 1910 and 1935, a period marked by social upheaval, waves of immigration, and widespread fear of spiritual corruption. Locals reported hearing screams carried on the wind from the cliffs during these years, inhuman sounds, distorted by fog and distance, dismissed by the diocese as superstition, hysteria, or the wild imagination of fishermen. The Great Depression and World War II further isolated the convent. Supplies grew scarce, the sisters more withdrawn. Sacred Heart's enrollment dwindled, but the order persisted, hidden behind high walls and the protective authority of the church. It was during this era that the convent's most enduring scandal whispered through. Barrows Point, a mass disappearance of orphans in 1947. Officially, the diocese claimed the children were relocated to larger facilities in Boston, but no records confirmed this. Families who inquired were met with silence, deflection, or threats of excommunication for spreading slanderous lies. Photographs from this period show hollow-eyed children on the convent steps, their expressions vacant, their presence fleeting. Some say the church buried the truth to protect its image. Others believe what happened within Sacred Heart's stone walls was more sinister. Ancient rituals hidden beneath the veneer of Catholic orthodoxy, practices that predated even the church itself. A history the church buries deep, and the cliffs refuse to forget. By the late 20th century, Sacred Heart had faded into obscurity, decaying relic on the edge of the world, its scandals softened by time but never erased. The sisters who remained were few, aging, bound by vows of silence and devotion. Yet, for those in Barrows Point, the convent was a wound that never fully healed, reminder that faith and fear often share the same shadow, and that some histories refuse to stay buried. The investigation into the Sacred Heart disappearances quickly spiraled beyond the confines of routine police work, evolving into something darker, more convoluted, a web of dead ends, half-truths, and chilling theories that refused to be contained. As the days bled into weeks, the initial hope of finding the 3 missing women alive began to wither, replaced by gnawing uncertainty and an atmosphere thick with fear. The official response grew increasingly desperate as law enforcement, clergy, and outside experts sifted through fragments of evidence, obscure historical records, and the unnerving whispers that clung to Sacred Heart like a fog dot. Maps of Barrows Point, cluttered police stations, marked with color-coded pins and scrawled annotations. Investigators charted every inch of the convent grounds, the forest paths, the jagged coastline, and the treacherous cliffs that framed the convent like crumbling teeth. Archival footage and photographs captured the search efforts, picking their way through decaying hallways, cadaver dogs straining near hidden corners, detectives poring over faded blueprints of the convent's architecture. But the physical search yielded little beyond the ominous bloodstains near the chapel steps, the shredded fragments of a nun's habit, and the unsettling realization that Sacred Heart's structure concealed more than met the eye. Case files mounted rapidly, overflowing with contradictory witness statements, historical oddities, and growing suspicions. Detectives interviewed clergy members across Maine, some cooperative, others evasive. Many professed ignorance regarding Sacred Heart's recent operations, citing the convent's increasing autonomy and isolation over the decades. But in private, certain priests admitted what the official records avoided: the convent had long been regarded as peculiar. Operating with minimal oversight, its small, insular community steeped in rituals and practices that often diverged from standard Catholic doctrine. As public pressure mounted, so did the theories, multiplying like weeds in the cracks of Barrow's Point's already fragile unity. The first, most conventional theory hinged on personal motive. Investigators considered the possibility that one or more of the women had intended to leave the convent, perhaps together. Rumors swirled of forbidden relationships, clandestine affairs hidden beneath the rigid hierarchy of Sacred Heart. Sister Evelyn Crane, known for her rebellious streak and troubled past, was central to this line of thinking. Her file revealed a pattern of defiance and impulsivity, with whispers suggesting a romantic entanglement, possibly with an outsider, or even another sister. In this scenario, the disappearances were voluntary, at first a planned escape that went horribly wrong, but the logistics didn't align. The gates remained locked from the inside, untouched. No footprints led away from the convent, even in freshly fallen snow. The bloodstains human, and later confirmed to match Sister Miriam. Doyle's rare blood type complicated any theory of escape. If this had been an elopement or stage disappearance, it was executed with impossible precision. Or it devolved into something far more sinister. The second theory veered underground literally. Sacred Heart's foundations dated back to the 19th century, and blueprints recovered from the diocese archives hinted at sub-basements, storage tunnels, and possibly even older structures beneath the convent. Local legends spoke of hidden passages carved into the cliffs, remnants of smuggler routes from the Prohibition era or older, undocumented chambers linked to the land's pre-Christian history. Some investigators fixated on the possibility that the missing women had discovered or accessed these forgotten spaces, willingly or otherwise. Crews attempted to search the convent's lower levels, but years of neglect, structural decay, and collapsed passageways thwarted progress. Footage shows investigators descending into the convent's damp, crumbling cellars, their flashlights slicing through suffocating darkness, illuminating walls thick with mold and salt corrosion. Old, rusted doors sealed off portions of the substructure. Strange symbols matching those reported along the cliffs were etched into the stone, though their origin and meaning remained unclear. No direct evidence linked these tunnels to the disappearances, but the possibilities fanned the flames of speculation. Beyond human motives and architectural mysteries, a third, more unsettling theory gained momentum, one rooted in Barrow's Point's folklore and the convent's tangled history. Whispers spoke of a presence older than Sacred Heart itself, predating the convent, the church, even European settlement. Indigenous oral traditions told of the cliffs as sacred, dangerous land, a threshold between worlds, where spirits lingered and the veil between life and death thinned. The Penobscot and Wabanaki peoples avoided the area, warning early settlers of strange lights, voices in the fog, and inexplicable vanishings long before Sacred Heart's foundation. In this version of events, the convent's construction atop Barrows Point wasn't coincidentally, was deliberate, a misguided attempt to sanctify land already steeped in ancient, unknowable forces. Some historians pointed to obscure documents suggesting that the founders of Sacred Heart were aware of the land's reputation but believed their faith could contain or redeem the cliffs. Over the decades, reports of supernatural phenomena, flickering lights, disembodied chanting, symbols appearing overnight, were dismissed as superstition or atmospheric anomalies. But now, with 3 women vanished, blood on stone, and no logical answers, even hardened skeptics in the community began to entertain darker possibilities. Paranormal investigators, fringe researchers, and self-proclaimed occult experts descended upon Barrows Point. They examined the symbols carved near the cliffs, comparing them to runes from ancient European traditions, maritime folklore, and esoteric religious texts. Some claimed the markings were protective wards, others argued they were invitations, rituals of summoning meant to awaken something long dormant beneath the waves or within the cliffs themselves. The church, meanwhile, remained frustratingly silent. The diocese issued carefully worded statements urging calm, denying involvement in any cover-up, while quietly removing records, limiting access to Sacred Heart's archives, and distancing itself from the convent altogether. Requests for Vatican intervention were met with bureaucratic delays or outright dismissal. To many in Barrows Point, this only fueled suspicion that the church knew more than it admitted about Sacred Heart's rituals. The disappearances and the land's history, as weeks turned to months, the investigation stagnated. Theories spiraled further into conjecture. Some insisted the women had been sacrificed, whether to ancient forces, secret cults, or dark religious rites. Others clung to more grounded fears: human trafficking, concealed violence, the possibility that the convent's foundations hid not tunnels, but graves. Without bodies, no theory could be proven, yet none could be dismissed outright. Detective Samuel Pierce, lead investigator at the time, reflects in a rare interview from 2002, his expression worn, eyes clouded with memory. I've seen disappearances. People run off, people get lost. But Sacred Heart, that wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It felt orchestrated. Like we weren't just missing clues. We weren't supposed to find them. The screen lingers on maps of Barrows Point, lines crisscrossing the cliffs and convent grounds like veins in a decaying body. Case files blur into stacks of paper. Theories scribbled in margins, photographs of blood-stained stone, weathered symbols etched into forgotten walls. The investigation remains officially unsolved, a cold case wrapped in layers of history, fear, and unanswered questions. But within Barrows Point, few believe the story ended there. Many are convinced the cliffs hold the truth buried beneath rock, sea, and silence, and whatever presence haunts Sacred Heart is still watching. In the chaotic weeks following the disappearance of the 3 women from Sacred Heart Convent, the search for answers spiraled into a frenzy of conflicting reports, misinformation, and outright fabrication. What began as a grim mystery soon dissolved into a maze of contradictions, every witness offering a different version of the truth. Every new lead tangled in rumor and speculation. The quiet coastal town of Barrows Point became the epicenter of a storm that no one could contain. As fact and fiction collided under the weight of national attention, The first wave of contradictions emerged almost immediately after the discovery of blood near the convent's chapel steps. Within days, reports surfaced from towns hundreds of miles away claims that Sister Evelyn Crane had been seen at a bus station in Portland, disheveled and muttering to herself, before vanishing into the night. Another sighting placed her in Boston, boarding a Greyhound with a man described only as tall, wearing dark glasses. Police followed these leads, reviewing security footage and questioning employees, but each account dissolved under scrutiny. Fuzzy images, faulty memories, timelines that didn't align. Similar reports followed for Sister Miriam Doyle and Sister Agnes Walsh, contradictory sightings, stretching from New Hampshire to as far as Quebec. In each account, the women appeared alone or together, sometimes in full religious attire, other times in civilian clothing, often described as confused, distressed, or moving with strange purpose. The inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Witness sketches varied wildly, one depicting Sister Agnes as frail and elderly, another portraying her as youthful and aggressive. Some reports claimed the women were hiding from the church, others insisted they were under duress, controlled by unknown individuals. As investigators struggled to sift through the noise, the media machine roared to life. Tabloids plastered the missing women's faces across their covers, sensationalizing every unverified claim. Headlines screamed across grocery store racks. Asterisk, runaway nuns, linked to cult plot. Asterisk, mysterious lights and the Sacred Heart disappearances. Is it alien abduction? Asterisk, devil in the convent. Blood rituals on the cliffs. Mainstream outlets, desperate to keep pace, offered slightly more restrained but equally speculative coverage, inviting self-proclaimed experts, exorcists, and conspiracy theorists onto talk shows to pontificate on Sacred Heart's sinister reputation. The result was a flood of misinformation that drowned any legitimate investigation. Local residents found themselves harassed by reporters, psychics, and fringe investigators. The convent grounds became a magnet for trespassers, curiosity seekers, and thrill hunters eager to glimpse the place where faith, fear, and folklore collided. Social media, still in its infancy in the early 1990s, gave way to zines, radio call-ins, and late-night talk shows peddling every possible version of events, from secret Vatican conspiracies to covert government experiments conducted beneath Sacred Heart. Inside Barrows Point, the misinformation deepened existing divisions. Those loyal to the church accused the media of exploiting the town's grief, turning tragedy into entertainment. Others, long skeptical of Sacred Heart's opaque operations, believed the sensational coverage contained fragments of truth buried beneath exaggeration. Theories of cult activity, secret rituals, and hidden tunnels were no longer confined to whispers. They filled headlines, fueled by decades-old rumors of vanished orphans, exorcisms, and ghostly lights along the cliffs. Former residents came forward with conflicting accounts of life within Sacred Heart. Some described the convent as strict but compassionate, a place of discipline and devotion. Others painted a darker picture: oppressive silence, forbidden rituals conducted in candlelit chambers, a culture of secrecy that punished curiosity. Yet even these testimonies clashed, each narrative bending to the speaker's memory, bias, or fear. Detectives found themselves chasing shadows. For every credible lead, a dozen false reports emerged. One claimed a fisherman discovered a blood-stained garment floating offshore, later identified as nothing more than discarded fabric from a nearby marina. Another involved a supposed witness to hooded figures performing ceremonies along the cliff's footage, revealed nothing but tourists and blurred wildlife. The chaos reached its peak when a group of self-styled paranormal investigators released a grainy video they claimed showed spectral figures near Sacred Heart's ruins. The footage, shaky and drenched in night vision green, depicted indistinct shapes moving among the mist, accompanied by faint chanting. Experts debunked the video within days, an obvious manipulation of shadows and sound, but the damage was done. The clip went viral, cementing the image of Sacred Heart as a place where the veil between worlds had thinned, where shadows whispered and people vanished. Amid this cacophony, the original investigation faltered. Resources were stretched thin, public trust eroded, and the lines between fact and folklore blurred beyond recognition. The missing women's families, desperate for clarity, found themselves navigating a landscape of half-truths, wild accusations, and media spectacle. Their grief was compounded by uncertainty in shore, which reports, if any, held fragments of their loved one's fate. Asterisk stories clash sightings hundreds of miles apart. Claims of cult activity blurring truth and rumor. Asterisk as winter deepened. The misinformation hardened into local legend. The cliffs of Barrows Point became synonymous with vanishing nuns, blood rituals, and ancient forces lurking beyond sight. Sacred Heart, now abandoned and decaying, stood as a monument to unanswered questions, its crumbling walls layered with graffiti, symbols, and offerings left by believers, skeptics, and the simply curious. The conflicting accounts never ceased. Even decades later, new sightings occasionally surface, fleeting glimpses of women in dark habits, walking the cliffs, shadows moving along the chapel's fractured windows. Some dismiss these as tricks of fog and imagination. Others insist that women never left Sacred Heart, and never will. In the end, the truth remains buried beneath layers of myth, memory, and misinformation, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, distorted by time and the very human hunger for answers, no matter how dark or unbelievable they may be. As the years dragged on and the official investigation into the Sacred Heart disappearances grew cold, fragments of overlooked testimonies and hidden witnesses slowly surfaced, quiet voices that had been drowned out by the chaos, fear, and sensationalism surrounding the case. These were not the voices of reporters or conspiracy theorists, but of those who had lived on the edges of the convent's decaying shadow, former staff, aging locals, and ex-sisters bound by old vows and older traumas. Their accounts, hushed and fragmented, wove a haunting portrait of life behind the convent walls, one marked by secrecy, ritual, and an ever-present sense of something watching from the dark. The first to break the silence was Thomas Bellamy, a former groundskeeper at Sacred Heart, whose tenure spanned from the early 1970s until just a few months before the women vanished. A reserved man, Bellamy had largely avoided public scrutiny, retreating to his modest home outside Barrows Point when the investigation spiraled out of control. But in a shadowed interview conducted years later, his weathered face etched with unease, Bellamy offered chilling details the police had overlooked. Asterisk, you see things up there. Asterisk, he muttered, voice rough with age and lingering fear. Asterisk, things you ain't supposed to. Figures, cloaked, moving through the trees at midnight. Thought it was my eyes playing tricks, but it wasn't just me. According to Bellamy, the convent's remote location, isolated by cliffs and forest, made it easy for strange activities to go unnoticed. But over the years, he witnessed inexplicable gatherings, hooded figures assembling near the cliffs beneath, moonlight, chanting in low guttural tones that didn't resemble Latin prayers or hymns. He was warned early on by the sisters, specifically Sister Agnes Walsh, to keep to the gardens and never ask questions. His job was to tend the grounds, repair broken fixtures, and ignore what happened after dark. Asterisk, Sister Agnes. She was different, asterisk, Bellamy reflected, eyes narrowing beneath the dim glow of the interview light. Asterisk didn't speak much, but when she did, there was always warning in it. She told me once, "Don't go near the eastern cliffs after sundown," said they walk there. When pressed on who they were, Bellamy only shook his head. Asterisk didn't ask, didn't want to know. Asterisk, other overlooked testimonies came from former residents of Barrows Point, those whose memories had been dismissed as hysteria or embellishment during the initial investigation. Margaret Holloway, known for her sharp tongue and fading eyesight, recalled as a young woman seeing flickering lights weaving between the trees behind Sacred Heart. At the time, she assumed it was the sisters at prayer, but as the disappearances dominated headlines, fragments of long-ignored warnings resurfaced. Asterisk, my grandmother used to say, "The cliffs weren't ours." Asterisk, Holloway shared in an interview recorded shortly before her death. Asterisk said there's older things out there, things that don't care much for crosses or prayers. Asterisk, yet the most disturbing accounts came from within the convent itself, from former nuns who had quietly left Sacred Heart long before the disappearances, carrying with them memories too heavy to share until the years dulled their fear. One such woman, identified only as Sister Anne for her protection, spoke anonymously in an interview decades later, her face obscured by shadow, voice trembling beneath the weight of old confessions. She had lived at Sacred Heart during the 1980s, entering the order at age 19, drawn by faith but soon confronted by the convent's darker undercurrents. Asterisk, it wasn't like other convents. Asterisk, Sister Anne whispered, fingers fidgeting with a rosary. Asterisk, there were rules. Different rules. We prayed, yes, but there were other gatherings. Candlelight rituals in the crypts. Chants I didn't recognize. Symbols carved into the chapel walls, hidden beneath the paint. Asterisk, when she questioned the practices, she was silenced, warned by senior sisters to obey or leave. Over time, she became convinced that Sacred Heart was protecting her, perhaps containing something far older and far less holy than the Church would ever admit. The final straw came when another young sister confided in her, sharing whispered warnings of things beneath the cliffs and a hunger that wakes if the old rites aren't kept. Days later, that sister was gone trance, according to official records, but Sister Anne never saw her again, terrified. She fled Sacred Heart under the guise of illness, severing ties with the Church and vanishing into anonymity for years, until the news of the disappearances reopened old wounds. Her testimony, dismissed by authorities as delusion, added weight to the growing suspicion that the convent's secrets ran deeper than anyone dared admit. Other former staff echoed similar stories. A nurse who tended two elderly sisters in the final years before the disappearances recalled treating women with unexplained injuries, bruises in strange patterns, fevers accompanied by delirious mutterings in archaic languages, some driven to near madness by what they described as visions from the cliffs. Her concerns, reported to diocesan officials, were buried under bureaucracy and silence. Overlooked maintenance records revealed odd patterns, doors sealed without explanation. Entire wings of the convent closed off for spiritual quarantine, storage rooms emptied and never reopened. Every fragment, dismissed individually, formed a tapestry of unease when viewed together. Even townsfolk, previously reluctant to speak, shared passing encounters that, in hindsight, felt sinister, strange footprints near the cliffs at dawn, the faint sound of chanting beneath crashing waves, hooded silhouettes glimpsed in the forest and gone before they could be confronted. These hidden voices, once dismissed as irrelevant or unreliable, painted a chilling picture of life behind sacred hearts' crumbling facade, portrait of cloaked figures at midnight, whispered warnings by candlelight, and an order far less holy than its name suggested. But by the time these testimonies emerged, it was too late. The convent stood abandoned, its halls empty, the cliffs eroding with each passing storm. The official investigation faded, buried beneath misinformation, fear, and institutional silence. Only the stories remained, whispered in shadowed interviews and passed along by those who remembered, the ones who saw, and the ones who listened. And beneath those jagged cliffs, the fog still rolls in, thick and cold, carrying with it the weight of warnings long ignored. As the investigation into the Sacred Heart, disappearances faltered under the weight of misinformation and silence. A handful of chilling discoveries began to surface, fragments of evidence buried beneath decades of dust, hidden in forgotten corners of the convent and scattered across the windswept cliffs of Barrow's Point. They weren't enough to solve the mystery, but they deepened it, adding sinister new layers that even the most hardened investigators struggled to explain. The most unsettling of these findings came nearly 2 months after the initial search, during a final, reluctant sweep of Sacred Heart's abandoned eastern wing. By then, most believed the convent had already surrendered everything it could. Bloodstains near the chapel steps, scraps of torn fabric by the cliffs, symbols carved into stone walls. But when structural engineers examined the eastern wing for signs of collapse, they uncovered a locked room that had been overlooked in prior searches, its door hidden behind warped wooden panels, its existence absent from blueprints. Breaking through the rusted lock revealed a small, windowless chamber cloaked in dust and shadows. What they found inside chilled even the most seasoned officers. Scattered across the narrow room were dozens of handwritten journals, stacked haphazardly on shelves, their covers cracked with age. The floor was littered with faded scraps of paper, notes, pages torn from prayer books, and crude, unsettling drawings etched in heavy graphite. The journals themselves were filled with meticulous, spidery script prayers, at first glance, but their content quickly deviated from the expected language of faith. Pages and pages recounted the eyes in the forest, describing them as ancient, unblinking, watching from the tree line, appearing most often beneath the full moon. The handwriting, believed to belong to Sister Miriam Doyle, became increasingly erratic over time, her words blending scripture with desperate pleas for protection. Some pages spoke of dreams of standing on the cliffs, surrounded by shadows whispering in forgotten tongues, of figures cloaked in robes, their faces hidden, their chants reverberating beneath the waves. Interspersed among the text were disturbing sketches, crude but haunting, dozens of staring eyes drawn in the margins, clustered in patterns that mirrored the symbols carved along the cliffs. One particularly alarming image depicted a robed figure with hollow, black eyes, arms outstretched, standing at the cliff's edge as the sea roiled below. Beneath the journals, investigators discovered a bundle of what initially appeared to be rosaries, but closer inspection revealed them to be something far more ominous: necklaces woven from animal sinew and tiny bones, shaped into crude protective talismans. Some were adorned with small, carved wooden medallions bearing the same unfamiliar symbols found etched into the trees near. Sacred Heart. Photographs from the investigation captured these details, the journals splayed open, their ink smudged by time, the bone talismans tangled together like grotesque ornaments, the unsettling symbols carved into wooden beams and window frames, often hidden beneath layers of peeling paint. Beyond the convent walls, similar symbols began appearing in the surrounding forest. Hikers reported finding them carved into tree trunks along hidden paths leading toward the cliffs. Some of the markings were fresh, suggesting recent activity despite the convent having been abandoned for weeks. Police documented these carvings, their crude lines forming the same spiral and eye-like shapes as those within the locked room, linking the forest to the convent's internal darkness. Even more unnerving were the reports from local search parties who combed the cliffs for signs of the missing women. Several volunteers described finding shallow depressions in the earth near the cliff's edge, as if something or someone had been kneeling in the soil. Nearby, more symbols were discovered, this time painted onto stones with what appeared to be dried blood. Though tests were inconclusive, among the recovered items was a torn scrap of fabric resembling the black wool habits worn by the Sacred Heart sisters. Faint smears of blood stained the cloth, and clutched within its folds was a small, brittle piece of parchment. On it, written in hurried, jagged script, was a phrase that investigators struggled to translate, a mixture of Latin and archaic symbols that scholars later connected to ancient protective rites, warnings used in early Christian sects to ward off what they referred to as the Ancient Ones of the deep earth. The deeper authorities dug, the stranger the discoveries became. A hidden crawlspace behind the convent's altar revealed additional artifacts: burnt candles arranged in ritualistic patterns, bowls filled with salt and ash, and fragments of animal bones charred beyond recognition. These remnants, tucked away behind sacred spaces, suggested that the rituals Sister Anne and other former staff spoke of were not exaggerated. Investigators also uncovered faded photographs hidden behind a false panel in the convent's library. The images, dated from the 1940s and 50s, depicted groups of sisters gathered along the cliffs at night, their faces obscured by hoods, their hands raised toward the crashing waves. The photos were grainy, damaged by time, but the faint outlines of symbols drawn into the sand were visible, matching those carved into the forest and found within the journals. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the fragments of audio recordings discovered among discarded belongings in the convent cellar. Though heavily degraded, portions of the tapes were recoverable. The recordings contained eerie, monotonous chanting interspersed with faint weeping and indecipherable whispers. Linguists and religious scholars who reviewed the tapes identified portions of the audio as corrupted versions of Latin prayers, blended with phonetic elements from ancient European pagan dialects languages, predating organized Christianity. Taken together, the evidence painted a chilling portrait of Sacred Heart's final days, not of quiet prayer and spiritual retreat, but of escalating paranoia, desperate rituals, and a growing belief among the sisters that they were being watched, hunted, or drawn into something beyond human comprehension. Despite these discoveries, the official stance remained frustratingly unchanged. With no bodies recovered and no concrete proof of foul play beyond the bloodstains, the case remained unsolved. Its horrors relegated to dusty evidence boxes and locked archives. Yet for those who explored the hidden rooms, deciphered the cryptic notes, and traced the symbols carved into the cliffs and trees, one truth became clear: the disappearances were not isolated. They were the latest echo in a history of secrecy, strange rites, and unsettling warnings stretching back generations. And in the sketches of unblinking eyes, the chants etched into forgotten tapes, and the crude symbols scarring the trees, a single message pulsed beneath it all. They had always been watching as the investigation into the Sacred Heart. Disappearances faltered under the weight of misinformation and silence. A handful of chilling discoveries began to surface, fragments of evidence buried beneath decades of dust, hidden in forgotten corners of the convent and scattered across the windswept cliffs of Barrows Point. They weren't enough to solve the mystery, but they deepened it, adding sinister new layers that even the most hardened investigators struggled to explain. The most unsettling of these findings came nearly 2 months after the initial search, during a final, reluctant sweep of Sacred Heart's abandoned eastern wing. By then, most believed the convent had already surrendered everything it could. Bloodstains near the chapel steps, scraps of torn fabric by the cliffs, symbols carved into stone walls. But when structural engineers examined the eastern wing for signs of collapse, they uncovered a locked room that had been overlooked in prior searches, its door hidden behind warped wooden panels, its existence absent from blueprints. Breaking through the rusted lock revealed a small, windowless chamber cloaked in dust and shadows. What they found inside chilled even the most seasoned officers. Scattered across the narrow room were dozens of handwritten journals, stacked haphazardly on shelves, their covers cracked with age. The floor was littered with faded scraps of paper, cryptic notes, pages torn from prayer books, and crude, unsettling drawings etched in heavy graphite. The journals themselves were filled with meticulous, spidery script prayers at first glance, but their content quickly deviated from the expected language of faith. Pages and pages recounted the eyes in the forest, describing them as ancient, unblinking, watching from the tree line, appearing most often beneath the full moon. The handwriting, believed to belong to Sister Miriam Doyle, became increasingly erratic over time, her words blending scripture with desperate pleas for protection. Some pages spoke of dreams of standing on the cliffs, surrounded by shadows whispering in forgotten tongues, of figures cloaked in robes, their faces hidden, their chants reverberating beneath the waves. Interspersed among the text were disturbing sketches, crude but haunting, dozens of staring eyes drawn in the margins, clustered in patterns that mirrored the symbols carved along the cliffs. One particularly alarming image depicted a robed figure with hollow, black eyes, arms outstretched, standing at the cliff's edge as the sea roiled below. Beneath the journals, investigators discovered a bundle of what initially appeared to be rosaries, but closer inspection revealed them to be something far more ominous: necklaces woven from animal sinew and tiny bones, shaped into crude protective talismans. Some were adorned with small, carved wooden medallions bearing the same unfamiliar symbols found etched into the trees near Sacred Heart. Photographs from the investigation captured these details, the journals splayed open, their ink smudged by time, the bone talismans tangled together like grotesque ornaments, the unsettling symbols carved into wooden beams and window frames, often hidden beneath layers of peeling paint. Beyond the convent walls, similar symbols began appearing in the surrounding forest. Hikers reported finding them carved into tree trunks along hidden paths leading toward the cliffs. Some of the markings were fresh, suggesting recent activity despite the convent having been abandoned for weeks. Police documented these carvings, their crude lines forming the same spiral and eye-like shapes as those within the locked room. linking the forest to the convent's internal darkness. Even more unnerving were the reports from local search parties, who combed the cliffs for signs of the missing women. Several volunteers described finding shallow depressions in the earth near the cliff's edge, as if something or someone had been kneeling in the soil. Nearby, more symbols were discovered, this time painted onto stones with what appeared to be dried blood. Though tests were inconclusive, among the recovered items was a torn scrap of fabric, resembling the black wool habits worn by the Sacred Heart Sisters. Faint smears of blood stained the cloth, and clutched within its folds was a small, brittle piece of parchment. On it, written in hurried, jagged script, was a phrase that investigators struggled to translate. A mixture of Latin and archaic symbols that scholars later connected to ancient protective rites, warnings used in early Christian sects to ward off what they referred to as the ancient ones of the deep earth. The deeper authorities dug, the stranger the discoveries became. A hidden crawl space behind the convent's altar revealed additional artifacts: burnt candles, arranged in ritualistic patterns, bowls filled with salt and ash, and fragments of animal bones charred beyond recognition. These remnants, tucked away behind sacred spaces, suggested that the rituals Sister Anne and other former staff spoke of were not exaggerated. Investigators also uncovered faded photographs hidden behind a false panel in the convent's library. The images, dated from the 1940s and 50s, depicted groups of sisters gathered along the cliffs at night, their faces obscured by hoods, their hands raised toward the crashing waves. The photos were grainy, damaged by time, but the faint outlines of symbols drawn into the sand were visible, matching those carved into the forest and found within the journals. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the fragments of audio recordings, discovered among discarded belongings in the convent cellar. Though heavily degraded, portions of the tapes were recoverable. The recordings contained eerie, monotonous chanting, interspersed with faint weeping and indecipherable whispers. Linguists and religious scholars who reviewed the tapes identified portions of the audio as corrupted versions of Latin prayers, blended with phonetic elements from ancient European pagan dialects languages, predating organized Christianity. Taken together, the evidence painted a chilling portrait of Sacred Heart's final days, not of quiet prayer and spiritual retreat, but of escalating paranoia, desperate rituals, and a growing belief among the sisters that they were being watched, hunted, or drawn into something beyond human comprehension. Despite these discoveries, the official stance remained frustratingly unchanged. With no bodies recovered and no concrete proof of foul play beyond the bloodstains, the case remained unsolved. Its horrors relegated to dusty evidence boxes and locked archives. Yet for those who explored the hidden rooms, deciphered the cryptic notes, and traced the symbols carved into the cliffs and trees, one truth became clear: the disappearances were not isolated. They were the latest echo in a history of secrecy, strange rites, and unsettling warnings stretching back generations. And in the sketches of unblinking eyes, the chants etched into forgotten tapes, and the crude symbols scarring the trees, a single message pulsed beneath it all. They had always been watching. The deeper investigators and independent researchers delved into the Sacred Heart mystery, the more they encountered symbols, cryptic messages, and ritualistic patterns that reached far beyond the familiar boundaries of Catholic faith. What initially appeared to be random carvings or the scrawled paranoia of frightened nuns gradually revealed a sinister consistency and network of symbols, phrases, an iconography traced to ancient, nearly forgotten sects that existed on the fringes of religious history. Sacred Heart Convent, it seemed, had been more than a house of prayer. It had been a place where boundaries between faith, folklore, and the unknown had blurred into dangerous territory. Photographs of the convent's interior and grounds captured these strange markings set into chapel walls, carved deep into wooden doorframes, hidden beneath layers of crumbling plaster. At first glance, they resembled protective symbols, perhaps even the handiwork of overzealous sisters trying to shield themselves from perceived evil. But as linguists and symbologists examined the evidence, unsettling connections emerged. Many of the symbols matched those found in medieval grimoires books of ritual magic and forbidden knowledge hidden from public view by the Church for centuries. Circular designs spiraled around central eye motifs, lines intersecting at unnatural angles, often accompanied by cryptic Latin phrases warped by archaic grammar. Phrases like custodes, sub terra, meaning the watchers beneath the earth, and oculos omnium, translated loosely as the eyes of all, repeated across journals, stone carvings, and handwritten notes hidden throughout. Sacred Heart. Researchers traced these elements to obscure religious offshoots from early Christianity sects, condemned by the Vatican as heretical, rumored to blend Gnostic beliefs with older, pre-Christian rituals honoring unseen forces that dwelled beneath the earth or sea. In some interpretations, these groups believed the world was constantly observed by the hidden eyes, ancient entities or spirits that predated human understanding, neither wholly divine nor entirely malevolent, but dangerous if ignored or provoked. The symbols found along the cliffs mirrored this theology, a combination of spirals, concentric circles, and crude eye-like shapes arranged with ritualistic precision. Weathered by salt and time, some markings were barely visible to the untrained eye, but those preserved in photographs and journals confirmed their consistency over decades, possibly longer. Further adding to the unnerving mosaic were the cryptic prayers discovered within Sister Miriam Doyle's journals. The text began as standard psalms and liturgical verses, but grew increasingly erratic, blending scripture with unknown phrases and incantations. Some pages contained Latin distortions, combined with what experts believed were remnants of Proto-Indo-European languages, fragments so ancient they defied complete translation. But the themes were clear pleas for protection, invocations against those who dwell beneath, and desperate affirmations that the rites must be kept, lest the earth hunger again. More alarming were references to the Vigilia Sanguinis, translated as the Vigil of Blood, an apparent ritual practiced at Sacred Heart under the cover of night. Testimonies from former nuns and hidden witnesses suggested this was not symbolic. Candles arranged in geometric patterns, offerings left near the cliffs, chants spoken in forgotten tongues. These rites were whispered to have taken place regularly, especially when the sea grew restless or strange lights danced along the horizon. Ancient religious texts, smuggled from dusty European archives, hinted at similar rites performed in coastal monasteries across Ireland, Brittany, and northern Spain centuries ago. In each case, the rituals were designed to appease or distract the watchers beneath entities often associated with deep caverns, treacherous cliffs, or the relentless sea. Their worshippers, cloaked in secrecy, believed that without these rituals, the land itself would turn hostile, devouring those who ignored its ancient demands. This chilling belief system, woven into the very foundation of Sacred Heart, suggested the convent's location atop Barrow's Point was no accident. Legends among local indigenous groups long warned of the cliffs as a sacred, dangerous place, a thin veil between worlds, where whispers rose from the earth and those who listened too closely sometimes vanished. The symbols found etched into trees and stones echoed petroglyph patterns found along the Maine coast, predating European colonization by centuries. The realization struck many investigators and scholars with grim clarity. Sacred Heart was not merely isolated by had been built upon a fault line of ancient fear and forgotten worship. The Catholic facade, with its crucifixes and stained glass windows, masked older rites that had persisted quietly within the convent's walls, blending superstition, desperation, and fragments of lost knowledge into something neither wholly spiritual nor entirely explainable. The cryptic symbols, prayers, and rituals uncovered at Sacred Heart painted a picture far more disturbing than the Church ever acknowledged. This was not merely a place of quiet devotion, it was a sanctuary guarding against forgotten horrors, a spiritual bulwark erected against the unknown forces whispered about in secret for generations. But by the time authorities understood the depth of the symbols and their history, it was too late. The three women were gone, their fates entwined with rites, symbols, and cryptic warnings that, to this day, remain etched into stone, hidden beneath layers of decay and left unanswered by the tide in the absence of hard evidence. As the Sacred Heart case grew colder and more contaminated by rumor, the only thing left to examine was the human mind, the fragile, unpredictable boundary between faith, fear, and psychological collapse. In the years following the disappearance of Sisters Miriam Doyle, Evelyn Crane, and Agnes Walsh, psychologists, cult researchers, and religious scholars have dissected the case, offering chilling insights into how belief, isolation, and group psychology can spiral into something far more dangerous than simple superstition. The Sacred Heart Convent was by design a place of retreat, a fortress of faith carved into the cliffs, miles from the nearest town, its community bound by silence, discipline, and unwavering devotion. But, as experts would later argue, such seclusion can do more than nurture piety. It can fracture perception, breeding an environment where reality bends to collective fears. Prolonged isolation in high-control, religious groups is a known catalyst for psychological deterioration. Explains Dr. Naomi Ellis, a clinical psychologist, specializing in religious trauma and groupthink dynamics. Sacred Heart fits the profile: physically isolated, ideologically rigid, historically secretive. It's the perfect storm for shared delusion to take root. Dr. Ellis points to well-documented cases where cloistered religious communities developed extreme beliefs, often escalating to self-destructive behavior. From medieval cults fearing the apocalypse to modern doomsday groups, the human mind, especially when cut off from external reality, can weave paranoia, faith, and fear into a dangerous cocktail. Sacred Heart, with its decaying walls, ritualistic secrecy, and whispered history of exorcisms and disappearances, bears all the hallmarks of such psychological escalation. For experts like Ellis, the signs are glaring. The hidden journals recovered from the convent, filled with frantic prayers, cryptic symbols, and drawings of unblinking eyes, suggest a progressive breakdown of mental stability, particularly in Sister Miriam Doyle. We see obsessional thinking, intrusive fears of being watched, and apocalyptic language. Ellis explains, referencing the journals. Asterisk in an environment where those fears are mirrored and reinforced by the group. It doesn't take much for paranoia to become collective reality. Asterisk cult experts draw even darker parallels. Dr. Marcus Delaney, who has spent decades researching fringe religious movements, compares Sacred Heart's trajectory to isolated sects that slowly detach from mainstream doctrine, embracing rituals and belief systems hidden from outside scrutiny. Asterisk, they often blend recognizable faith Catholicism, in this case with esoteric practices, creating an internal mythology that outsiders don't understand. Asterisk, Delaney says. Asterisk, Sacred Heart wasn't just praying. They were performing rituals, invoking symbols, responding to perceived threats no one else could see. To them, the danger was really von if it originated in their own minds. Delaney references the sanguinus, asterisk, the so-called vigil of blood described in recovered writings. While mainstream church authorities dismiss these accounts as nonsense, cult researchers view such practices as symptomatic of escalating spiritual paranoia, group convinced that invisible forces are at work, demanding appeasement. But what pushes a devout community from prayer to fear-driven ritual? Psychologists suggest it's a gradual erosion, exacerbated by the convent's extreme isolation. Sacred Heart's history reveals decades of decline, fewer sisters, waning church oversight, a crumbling structure perched on cliffs known for disappearances and whispered legends. Over time, the shrinking community grew insular, their fears amplifying within echo chambers of devotion and secrecy. Dr. Ellis describes this as asterisk ideological claustrophobia. Asterisk where spiritual beliefs loop endlessly, unchallenged by the outside world. The convent's remote location, inaccessible during storms or winter months, only reinforced this dynamic. Former residents, now willing to speak under anonymity, confirmed the psychological pressure. One ex-sister describes whispered warnings passed along in candlelit halls, warnings of the eyes in the forest, of something beneath the cliffs that never sleeps. Another recounts hearing muffled chanting at night, of sisters isolating themselves for private rituals beyond sanctioned prayer. These behaviors, experts argue, align with known patterns of delusional group reinforcement where fear begets ritual, and ritual begets deeper belief, regardless of external facts. But could such beliefs turn lethal? For psychologists, the answer is disturbingly clear. Asterisk, when faith mutates into fear, and rituals escalate without relief, communities can spiral into self-harm or disappearance. Asterisk, Delaney warns, citing examples like the Solar Temple cult or historical religious enclaves that vanished under mysterious, often tragic circumstances. In Sacred Heart's case, the specifics remain murky, but experts believe the groundwork was there. An isolated community immersed in superstition, engaging in obscure rites, convinced they were being watched or hunted by forces beyond comprehension. Even the reported blood rituals dismissed by the Church as folklore fit within known psychological phenomena. Anthropological studies reveal countless instances where isolated groups turn to blood symbolism during perceived spiritual crises, a visceral manifestation of fear, control, and desperate appeasement. Dr. Ellis emphasizes the role of shared psychosis, or folly a plus years, where delusional beliefs ripple through close-knit groups. Asterisk, if key figures like Sister Agnes or Miriam express intense fear of external threats, and the environment reinforces that narrative, others adopt the belief to maintain unity and reduce uncertainty. Asterisk, she explains, such dynamics can lead two collective actions that, to outsiders, appear irrational or sinister disappearances staged as protective measures, rituals performed to stave off imagined doom, even voluntary vanishing as a final act of spiritual surrender. Yet not all experts agree. The events at Sacred Heart can be reduced to psychology alone. Dr. Delaney acknowledges an unsettling gap in conventional explanations. Asterisk, we have the journals, symbols, rituals, all pointing to escalating delusion. Asterisk, he concedes. Asterisk, but the specifics, the locked gates, absence of footprints, the symbols etched miles apart, those details suggest something more orchestrated, possibly involving external actors or knowledge unknown to modern psychology. Asterisk, this ambiguity haunts Sacred Heart's legacy. Was it mass delusion spiraling into tragedy, a cult imploding under its own paranoia? Or did the sisters' fears of ancient watchers, rituals left incomplete, reflect something rooted not in the mind but the land itself? The psychological lens offers clarity but not closure. As Ellis reflects, asterisk, belief is powerful enough to destroy, but sometimes belief is shaped by things we don't yet understand. Asterisk, decades later, Sacred Heart remains a testament to both possibilities, a place where devotion twisted into dread, where isolation bred shadows, and where, whether through psychosis, ritual, or forces beyond comprehension, three women stepped beyond the veil of reason and were never seen again. The reconstructed timeline of the Sacred Heart disappearances presents a chillingly precise sequence of events. A tightly compressed window where ordinary life within the convent deteriorated into silence, fear, and ultimately vanishing. Though distorted by misinformation and cloaked in secrecy, investigators piece together the most credible chronology from police reports, local testimonies, and hidden evidence, unveiling a sequence marked by ritual, blood, and an unsettling void where answers should be. It begins on December 3rd, 1992, the last confirmed sighting of the three missing women, Sister Miriam Doyle, Sister Evelyn Crane, and Sister Agnes Walsh. That evening, shortly after Vespers, the sisters were seen by the convent's housekeeper in the main corridor leading toward the chapel. Witnesses described them as appearing tense but composed, Sister Miriam clutching a leather-bound journal, Sister Evelyn whispering urgently to Sister Agnes. All three entered the chapel through the heavy oak doors. That was the final moment anyone outside the convent verifiably saw them alive. The next 24 hours remain a fog of conflicting accounts and fractured memories. December 4th passed with no sign of the women. Initially, other sisters believed the three had retreated for extended prayer or fasting, common practice, especially during Advent. But unease crept in as daylight faded and their absence persisted. Locals later reported strange occurrences. That same night, faint chanting drifting from the cliffs, flickering lights in the forest, and symbols newly carved, peering along trees that bordered the convent grounds. By the morning of December 5th, concern gave way to alarm. When the chapel remained locked and unanswered, clergy forced entry. Inside, they discovered ominous signs, faint but unmistakable bloodstains trailing across the stone floor near the altar steps, torn fragments of dark fabric, consistent with religious habits, lay tangled near the sanctuary's eastern wall. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle beyond the blood-crimson smear on cold stone, the only evidence of violence. The police were contacted immediately. By midday, Sacred Heart was sealed off as investigators scoured the grounds. Search dogs reacted near the cliffs behind the chapel, barking and pacing along jagged rocks, but found no physical traces of the missing women beyond the blood and fabric. Locals gathered near the convent gates as news spread, their whispers, fractured between fear and suspicion. By the evening of December 6th, Sacred Heart had fallen into an eerie, absolute silence. The remaining sisters, already shaken, refused to stay in the chapel overnight. Several reported hearing strange, rhythmic tapping behind the walls, though no source could be found. One groundskeeper claimed to see cloaked figures along the tree line at dusk, though his report was initially dismissed as stress-induced paranoia. December 7th, authorities expanded the search beyond Sacred Heart, combing the cliffs, forests, and surrounding coastline. Helicopters hovered above Barrows Point, their spotlights slicing through thick fog. Police divers searched tidal pools and sea caves, though dangerous currents hindered progress. Volunteers formed search parties, while the media descended upon the isolated town, turning the convent into a national spectacle in the following days. New layers of the mystery emerged. On December 8th, police discovered the locked room hidden behind warped paneling in Sacred Heart's eastern wing. Inside were journals filled with frantic prayers, sketches of eyes, and symbols echoing those carved along the cliffs. Alongside them were crude talismans, bone and sinew necklaces believed to serve as protection. These unsettling artifacts deepened suspicions that the disappearances were tied to ritualistic practices rather than conventional crime. December 10th, fresh reports surfaced of symbols etched into the surrounding forest, some appearing overnight. Hikers and search volunteers described finding spirals and eye-like shapes gouged into tree trunks. Investigators documented and photographed the markings, noting their similarity to those inside the convent and along the cliffs. By December 12th, the investigation's trajectory began to fracture. Tabloids printed sensational headlines: runaway nuns in cult plot, blood rituals on the Maine coast, flooding the public with misinformation. Simultaneously, conflicting witness accounts placed Sister Evelyn in Portland, Boston. Even Quebec, though none could be substantiated. Between December 15th and 20th, police conducted extensive interviews with clergy, former Sacred Heart staff, and townspeople. Their testimonies revealed alarming patterns, whispered warnings of the watchers, rituals performed during full moons, and a long-standing fear of the cliff's ancient reputation. Yet no evidence surfaced to explain how 3 women vanished from within locked walls, leaving only blood, symbols, and silence behind. By December 21st, with no new leads, the official search scaled back. Barrows Point settled into uneasy resignation, the cliffs looming as a grim reminder of unanswered questions. Sacred Heart stood abandoned, its decaying halls sealed under police order, its stone facade weathering beneath winter storms. In the weeks that followed, sporadic discoveries fueled lingering terror. More symbols emerged along the cliffs and forest paths, some old, some disturbingly fresh. Faded photographs surfaced of hooded figures on the cliffs decades prior, hinting at a ritualistic history buried beneath the convent's foundation. Audio recordings recovered from Sacred Heart contained distorted chants in fractured Latin, blending scripture with forgotten dialects. By early January 1993, the case unofficially entered cold status. The disappearances, blood evidence, and mounting folklore cemented Sacred Heart's infamy. But the investigation yielded no bodies, no suspects, no definitive answers. The final, haunting entries in Sister Miriam's journal, dated ***December 3rd***, offer the last known insight before the timeline fractures into silence. Asterisk, the eyes are closer now. We have kept the rites, but I fear it is not enough. Agnes says the cliffs whisper at night. Evelyn saw them among the trees. Tonight we pray, or we fall. Asterisk, those words, scribbled in frantic, uneven script, marked the final moment of known clarity before Sacred Heart fell silent forever. The timeline ends, but the echoes persist etched in stone, whispered along the cliffs, buried beneath layers of blood, belief, and secrets no one has dared to fully unearth. In the years that followed the disappearance of Sisters Miriam Doyle, Evelyn Crane, and Agnes Walsh, Sacred Heart Convent slowly surrendered to nature and silence. The once proud stone structure, perched defiantly on the cliffs of Barrows Point for over a century, now crumbles beneath salt winds and creeping vines. Its stained glass windows lie shattered, the chapel doors hang ajar, and the carved crucifix that once watched over the grounds lies twisted in the overgrowth. Time has reclaimed the convent, but the unanswered questions and the unease have never faded. Officially, the case remains unsolved. 3 decades have passed without arrests, confessions, or credible evidence pointing to the fate of the missing women. The police files sit dormant, a dusty archive of contradictory reports, blood-stained photographs, and transcripts of interviews that led nowhere. For many in Barrows Point, the investigation ended not with answers, but with creeping acceptance that some truths, like the fog that swallows the cliffs, refuse to be grasped. But the unanswered prayers persist, whispered through the fractured community that still carries the weight of Sacred Heart's shadow. Among the townspeople, scars remain. Some cling to faith, convinced the women were martyrs caught in a spiritual battle beyond human understanding. Others whisper of darker explanations, ritual gone wrong, a cult hidden in plain sight, or the resurgence of ancient forces the convent's walls were built to contain. Over the years, Sacred Heart has drawn curiosity seekers, conspiracy theorists, and urban explorers, each hoping to uncover the missing pieces left behind. Most find only rot and decay-collapsed ceilings, mold-choked corridors, and symbols weathered into near oblivion along the chapel's crumbling stones. But the brave, or perhaps the foolish, sometimes venture deeper. They report strange findings. Ritualistic arrangements of candles long melted into the floorboards, carvings in forgotten stairwells depicting spirals and unblinking eyes, and fragments of journal pages tucked beneath floorboards, scrawled with the same desperate prayers. Discovered during the original investigation, some claim to hear faint chanting echoing from the cliffs at night, though skeptics dismiss these accounts as tricks of wind and imagination. Despite the silence from law enforcement, independent researchers and cult experts continue to analyze the case, piecing together fragments left behind. Linguists still debate the meaning of the cryptic Latin phrases etched into Sacred Heart's stones. Symbologists trace the markings to forgotten sects and pagan traditions, suggesting the convent's history is tangled in far older, more arcane practices than the Catholic Church publicly admits. The missing women themselves have become spectral, figures within local folklore, symbols of mystery, caution, and the thin line between faith and fanaticism. Children dare each other to approach the convent ruins after dark. Ghost hunters set up equipment along the cliffs, chasing fleeting shadows and unexplained voices. Books, podcasts, and late-night documentaries recount the Sacred Heart legend, each version bending the facts to fit their chosen narrative: cult abduction, mass hysteria, or a far more supernatural reckoning. For the families of the missing, the aftermath has been a long, bitter vigil. They have held candlelight memorials on the convent grounds, petitioned the church for renewed investigations, and fought to keep their loved ones' names from vanishing beneath layers of sensationalism. But after 30 years, the grief has hardened into resignation. The hope of resolution drowned beneath the same coastal fog that swallowed Sacred Heart whole. In recent years, development plans have threatened the convent Ruenza, proposal to demolish the structure and redevelop. The land for luxury homes sparked fierce public backlash. Preservationists argue that Sacred Heart, for all its darkness, is a monument to unanswered questions, a relic of both faith and fear that deserves to stand untouched as a reminder of the town's unresolved past. Others, weary of the superstition and tourism it attracts, quietly root for its erasure. Yet the land resists. Contractors report equipment failures, sudden injuries, and a persistent sense of unease that lingers across Barrows Point. More than one project has faltered before the first stone was moved, as if the cliffs themselves reject intrusion. 3 decades later, Sacred Heart remains, cloaked in vines and shadows, its once grand halls reduced to decay, its chapel consumed by silence. But beneath the ruin lies something stubborn and absence that festers, an unfinished story etched into blood-stained stone, forgotten symbols, and whispered warnings carried by the sea wind. No arrests, no bodies, no closure, only unanswered prayers, and the eyes, they say, still watching from the forest. 3 decades after the vanishing of sisters Miriam Doyle, Evelyn Crane, and Agnes Walsh from the isolated Sacred Heart Convent, the mystery remains suspended in a fog of conflicting theories, unanswered questions, and chilling fragments of evidence. To this day, the case inspires heated debate among investigators, cult researchers, folklore scholars, and skeptics alike. At the heart of every conversation lies the same uncomfortable truth: no bodies, no arrests, and no verifiable conclusion, and lies a tangled web of possibilities that refuse to fully unravel. The dominant theory, at least in the eyes of traditional law enforcement, remains the most grounded foul play. According to this perspective, the disappearance was the result of an internal conflict, an act of violence, or calculated abduction concealed beneath the convent's religious facade. Proponents point to the bloodstains near the chapel steps, the torn fragments of the sisters' habits, and the conspicuous timeline, narrow window between the last confirmed sighting and the eerie discovery of an abandoned, blood-marked chapel. Detective Alan Winters, who worked the case during its early stages, still leans heavily on this explanation. In archived interviews, he describes the investigation's focus on potential motives within the Sacred Heart community. He emphasizes that it had been shrinking, increasingly isolated, and, in some accounts, rife with internal divisions. Asterisk, you've got 3 women, each carrying baggage, personal doubts, whispered disagreements, tension behind closed doors. Asterisk, Winters explained. Asterisk, something happens. It escalates. You get panic, cover-up, and the rest. Well, it disappears with the tide. Asterisk, critics of this theory, however, argue that it fails to address crucial inconsistencies: the absence of bodies despite extensive searches, the lack of defensive injuries, the sheer logistical challenge of moving victims unnoticed from the isolated convent grounds, and the unsettling evidence uncovered in the aftermath: symbols carved into trees, ritual artifacts, cryptic journal entries, and whispers of older, more complex beliefs festering beneath Sacred Heart's crumbling walls, which leads to the second, more sinister theory: clandestine cult activity. This hypothesis gained traction as investigators uncovered fragments of ritual paraphernalia within Sacred Heart's sealed rooms, bone talismans, protective symbols, journals saturated with prayers, warped by paranoia, and chilling references to the watchers beneath and the vigil of blood. The presence of obscure religious symbols etched into chapel walls, carved into forest trees, and even painted along cliff edges suggests a belief system operating beyond conventional Catholic doctrine. Cult expert Dr. Marcus Delaney, whose work focuses on isolated religious movements, believes Sacred Heart evolved into what he terms a closed spiritual enclave, a group blending Orthodox faith with esoteric, possibly pre-Christian rituals inherited from local folklore or ancient European sects. What began as devotion often mutates under pressure, Delaney explains. Add isolation, fear, and belief in unseen forces, and you create the perfect storm for ritual escalations, sometimes with deadly consequences. The Vigilia Sanguinis or Vigil of Blood, described in Sister Miriam's journals and corroborated by former staff, stands at the center of this theory. Though shrouded in ambiguity, references to offerings, chants in forgotten tongues, and ritualistic gatherings along the cliffs point to ceremonies meant to appease what exactly remains unclear. Some believe the rituals were symbolic, a desperate effort by frightened women to regain spiritual control amid growing dread. Others insist the rites were more than metaphor, that they invoked, intentionally or otherwise, something dangerous, something ancient. But even within the cult framework, factions arise. One group contends that the women were victims of an internal signal clash between those clinging to traditional faith and others seduced by darker practices. This theory posits that the disappearances were orchestrated by zealots within Sacred Heart to silence dissent, maintain secrecy, or fulfill sacrificial rites rooted in ancient superstition. Alternatively, some believe all three women willingly vanished participants in a ritual designed to transcend physical boundaries, to commune with the unseen forces their journals so fearfully reference. Proponents of this view point to the absence of struggle, the methodical nature of the symbols, and historic patterns of spiritual retreats culminating in disappearance, self-imposed exile driven by belief, not violence. The third, and perhaps most unnerving theory, is one that edges beyond psychological explanation into the supernatural. It is a theory grounded in whispers, folklore, and the eerie consistency of certain details, the symbols that predate Sacred Heart's founding, the alignment of carvings along ancient pathways, the indigenous legends warning of the cliffs that watch, and the recurring motif of eyes etched into stone, trees, and journal pages. Scholars of regional folklore trace the Barrows Point area back to long before European settlement. Oral traditions speak of the cliffs as sacred yet cursed thresholds where the earth and sea conceal entities older than language, entities that observe, that hunger, that test those who dwell too near. Similar patterns emerge along remote coastlines, in Ireland, Brittany, and the Scottish Isles, where monastic communities purportedly vanished amid tales of lights along the shore, unblinking eyes in the dark, and chants carried by the wind. Folklorist Dr. Evelyn Marrow sees chilling continuity in the Sacred Heart case. You can dismiss it as coincidence. Marrow acknowledges, but the pattern repeats. Isolated religious groups settle in thin places, geographical thresholds steeped in myth. Over time, fear takes root, ritual follows, and when the balance breaks, people disappear. The supernatural theory suggests the women of Sacred Heart did not simply vanish by human means, but were claimed by forces beyond comprehension drawn into the cliffs. Consumed by an ancient presence their rites failed to appease. Advocates point to the failed searches, the blood without bodies, the strange lights, and the absence of footprints as evidence of a disappearance orchestrated not by human hands, but by the very land itself, what lies beneath it. Skeptics, of course, dismiss this outright, labeling it hysteria compounded by isolation, psychological deterioration, and myth-making. Yet the persistence of symbols, the rhythmic return of carved warnings, and the strange phenomena reported by visitors long after Sacred Heart's abandonment keep this theory alive. In the end, each explanation, foul play, cult manipulation, supernatural intervention collides against the same unyielding wall of uncertainty. Each carries pieces of the truth, yet none fully accounts for the tangled, haunting puzzle left in Sacred Heart's decaying wake. What remains, beyond conjecture, is the unsettling legacy of Sacred Heart. 3 women, devout and fractured, stepping through heavy oak doors, blood on chapel steps, symbols etched in hidden places, whispers of rituals, of watchers in the forest, and a silence stretching across 30 years, broken only by crashing waves, the rustle of wind through decayed halls, and unanswered prayers echoing against stone. The cliffs endure, the symbols fade but never vanish entirely. The theories evolve, but refuse to settle, and Sacred Heart stands decayed, forgotten by time, but festering with the weight of possibilities darker, older, and far from resolved. The disappearance of sisters Miriam Doyle, Evelyn Crane, and Agnes Walsh from Sacred Heart Convent may seem like an isolated tragedy, product of remote cliffs, religious secrecy, and the peculiar shadows clinging to Barrow's Point. But as investigators and researchers peeled back the layers of this haunting case, they found an unsettling truth. Sacred Heart is not alone. Across continents and decades, eerily similar vanishings and unexplained events have echoed through convents, monasteries, and religious enclaves, concealed beneath veils of faith, tradition, and silence. On the surface, these incidents appear disconnected, scattered across the globe, separated by language, denomination, and culture. But scratch beneath the surface, and the parallels emerge. Isolated sacred grounds, tight-knit religious communities, whispered rituals diverging from sanctioned doctrine, and most disturbingly, the sudden, unexplained vanishing of individuals, often women without a trace. One of the most infamous examples dates back to 1949. In the rugged hills of Galicia, Spain, the Convent de Santa Marta, a Carmelite monastery known for its reclusive order of nuns, became the center of national scandal when 4 sisters reportedly disappeared overnight. As with Sacred Heart, there were no bodies, no signs of forced entry, and only cryptic symbols, crosses, interlaced with spirals, carved into the ancient stone walls of the chapel's crypt. Local folklore traced the region's history to pre-Christian times, with persistent legends of Las Vigilantes del Bosque, the watchers of the forest beings, said to observe and punish those who trespass on sacred ground unprepared. Authorities blamed the incident on internal conflict or miscommunication, but no concrete explanation ever surfaced. The convent was shuttered a year later, its stone facade overtaken by vines and silence. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1977. Argentina's windswept Tierra del Fuego bore witness to a similar mystery. The Monasterio de San Miguel, perched along the jagged southern coastline, made international headlines after 5 novices vanished under similarly unexplained circumstances. Survivors within the monastery reported strange chanting at night, symbols appearing along cliffside paths, and growing paranoia among the sisters in the weeks leading up to the disappearances. Once again, investigators found no bodies-only remnants of ritual items, fragmented journals filled with pleas for protection, and references to ancient spirits said to dwell beneath the sea. The case remains unsolved, with locals avoiding the monastery ruins to this day, warning visitors of the eyes beyond the waves. In the remote Scottish Highlands, the St. Breca Priory incident of 1963 further compounds the eerie pattern. Situated atop weather-beaten cliffs, much like Sacred Heart, the priory endured decades of whispered rumors concerning the old faith practiced in secret. That year, 2 sisters vanished following reports of strange lights along the moors and symbols etched into standing stones near the property. Investigators found altars arranged in geometric patterns, with offerings of salt and bone symbols mirrored in the later Sacred Heart investigation. Locals spoke of the Dowen SDH, ancient beings from Celtic folklore said to dwell beneath the earth, watching and waiting. Experts in religious anthropology and folklore have documented over a dozen additional cases where isolated convents or monasteries experienced unexplained vanishings, strange rituals, or the sudden collective disappearance of members. From **, the Capuchin monastery vanishings in Quebec 1954 **2, the disappearance of novices from a French abbey near Mont Saint-Michel 1921. Common threads persist: secluded sacred spaces, the presence of arcane symbols, escalating spiritual paranoia, and always an enduring silence left in the wake of vanishing lives. Dr. Evelyn Marrow, a folklorist specializing in religious enclaves and thin places, locations believed to blur the line between physical and spiritual realms, believes these incidents stem from ancient cultural fears interwoven with isolated faith communities. Across history, we see religious spaces established atop older pre-Christian site places tied to folklore of watchers, guardians, or hidden entities. Marrow explains. When belief systems clash with deep-rooted legends, and isolation erodes reason, communities sometimes spiral into fear-driven rituals, whether to appease perceived forces or ward off ancient curses. Marrow's research highlights the disturbing recurrence of specific symbols across these global cases: spirals, unblinking eyes, geometric arrangements around sacred spaces, and cryptic inscriptions blending Latin with older, fragmented languages. Such symbols surfaced repeatedly in Sacred Heart carvings along the cliffs, etched into trees, hidden in forgotten convent rooms, and scribbled across Sister Miriam's journals. Skeptics dismiss these connections as coincidental or rooted in psychological patterns, scintillated groups succumbing to mass delusion, fear manifesting as ritual, and the human mind crafting superstition to explain the unknown. But even critics struggle to dismiss the eerie consistency of details across countries, cultures, and generations. The Vatican, when pressed, offers little more than official denials or acknowledgments of tragic, unexplained losses, often invoking human error or environmental factors, while quietly sealing archival records behind layers of bureaucracy. Yet, for those who have studied the Sacred Heart case, alongside its global counterparts, The puzzle refuses to resolve into a neat conclusion. In each incident, isolated religious grounds, perched along cliffs, forests, or remote coastlines. Disappearances of women, often sisters or novices bound by strict vows of silence and devotion. The sudden eruption of fear-driven rituals, protective symbols, and desperate prayers. And the inescapable absence of resolution. No bodies recovered, no perpetrators identified, only silence, symbols, and lingering shadows. Sacred Heart Convent is merely the latest chapter in a much older, globally echoed narrative, convergence of spiritual fervor, geographic isolation, and ancient, perhaps forgotten forces that seem to stir when certain conditions align. The map grows increasingly crowded with red dots marking convents, monasteries, and religious enclaves consumed by similar mysteries. From the windswept cliffs of Maine to the forests of Galicia, the icy shores of Tierra del Fuego, and the haunted highlands of Scotland, the pattern holds. 3 women vanished from Sacred Heart. Their fate remains unknown, but they are not alone. In the annals of religious history, the shadows extend farther than Barrow's Point. The unanswered prayers drift farther than the cliffs, and across the world, sacred grounds still conceal their secrets, their symbols etched in stone, their watchers patient and unseen. As dusk settles over Barrow's Point, the silhouette of Sacred Heart Convent fades into the mist of fractured skeleton of stone, glass, and silence, clinging to the cliffs above the restless sea. The jagged rocks below gleam slick with salt spray, waves crashing relentlessly, as they have for centuries, as they did on that winter night in 1992 when 3 women passed through the heavy oak doors and were never seen again. Time has weathered the convent's walls, peeling paint from decayed window frames, pulling ivy through fractured stone, erasing the boundaries between human construction and the wild consuming land. But time has not eroded the questions that still linger, questions heavier than the salt air, older than the twisted vines overtaking the chapel walls. The same questions whispered by investigators, families, and those drawn by morbid curiosity to this forgotten corner of the Maine coast. What happened to sisters Miriam Doyle, Evelyn Crane, and Agnes Walsh? Where did they go? And perhaps the most unsettling, what did they believe they were facing in those final hours? Faith, in its purest form, offers answers. It provides a framework for uncertainty, a promise that beyond suffering lies redemption, beyond fear, peace. But Sacred Heart's legacy reminds us that faith does not always bring comfort. Sometimes faith intertwines with fear so completely that the two become indistinguishable. Sometimes belief is a lighthouse in the storm. Other times it draws you toward the rocks. For 3 decades, the mystery of Sacred Heart has endured not only because of the absence of answers, but because of the disturbing fragments left behind there. Blood on chapel steps without bodies, the symbols etched into trees and stone, the frantic prayers scribbled in journals, warning of watchers and rituals, of ancient things older than the convent's crumbling foundation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is how easily the human mind can tip into shadows when belief festers without challenge, when whispered legends of ancient watchers or thin places erode the boundary between reality and myth. Some say Sacred Heart collapsed under the weight of psychological delusion, a closed community spiraling into fear and ritual until reason fractured entirely. Others insist something older lingers along the cliff, something predating scripture, woven into the land itself, patient and watchful. They point to the symbols traced to forgotten sects, the echoes of similar disappearances across distant monasteries and convents, the chilling consistency of spiral carvings, unblinking eyes, and whispered warnings passed down through generations. But beyond theory's foul play, cult, supernatural remains the unchangeable fact. 3 women are gone, lost beneath a tide of unanswered prayers and fractured faith, their names etched into memorial plaques, their photographs fading on missing persons reports, their absence festering in the hearts of those left behind. Sacred Heart, now reclaimed by decay, stands as a monument to that absence, a testament to the human yearning for answers where none come, to the spaces where belief meets terror, and to the thin line between devotion and darkness. Some say you can still hear faint chanting when the fog rolls in, or see flickering lights near the cliffs when the moon is high. Skeptics dismiss these as superstition, tricks of sound and mist. But others, those who have walked the abandoned halls, seen the symbols half buried in ivy, or traced the jagged path to the cliff's edge, speak in hushed tones of something unresolved and unfinished ritual, an ancient presence never fully appeased, a story that refuses to fade. In the end, Sacred Heart reminds us of the questions that persist when faith collides with fear, when ancient symbols resurface in forgotten places, when the human mind, left to its own shadows, crafts monsters to explain the unknown. It reminds us, too, that some prayers, uttered in desperation, whispered beneath candlelight, carved into stone, are never answered. The cliffs keep their secrets, the sea keeps its dead, and Sacred Heart remains a shell of stone and silence, its answers devoured by fog, time, and the haunting truth that even faith, in its most desperate form, cannot always save us from the darkness we cannot see, or the darkness we create ourselves.